Our next speaker is Scott Thomas from University of Bath, and his title is The English School and the Cultural Foundations of International Order. And of course, with the English school, everything improves, anyway. So thank you very much.
Yes, I changed the title, which I will give you in a moment. Some water. I ate a hamburger last night with a knife and fork, and the people around me did begin to look at me a little bit strangely, I have to confess. Now, whether or not what that exactly says on who is civilized, I will leave it for you to decide. I did change the title of my paper from looking at the English School of International Relations in relationship to these issues, because I had a worry that that might be a slightly more technical kind of concept. I will only say one thing about the English School of International Relations, which was basically founded by the English, except it was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, in other words, American money. But the important thing is that while the Americans were so concerned about the Cold War, the British, because of the end of empire, were concerned from the beginning with what it means to live in a kind of multicultural kind of world. And that's the sources for the origins, if you will, for the English School of International Relations, of which, if you're not that aware of it and you need to know more about it, you can talk to many of us here, and indeed Fabio and I, who were basically inculcated or educated in one of the citadels of this at the London School of Economics. So, the title of my paper, Crusades and the Clash of Civilizations Then and Now, Is There Another Way of Seeing the World? And I felt this presentation would be a lot more relevant to what we're discussing. Let me begin with a statement by my most favorite scholar of international relations, the American humorist Will Rogers, whom I even talk about him in my Theory of International Relations class. Will Rogers was once asked, is civilization progressing? And he said, sure, civilization is progressing. In each war, they kill you in a new way, which pretty much, sadly, is the truth. And whether we're going to make progress on that is a much larger question. But also, I wrote a book about 10 years ago called The Global Resurgence of Religion and the Transformation of International Relations. And everything I've done since then is basically a continuation of the very last sentence of that book, which simply says this: seeing the world and understanding what is going on within it differently is already a way of beginning to change it. And so this is why theory matters and theology matters for the study of both social policy and foreign policy. Because I'm either the third, fourth, or fifth speaker, depending how you count, this has given me an opportunity to reorient some of the kinds of things I want to say. So first of all, one, this idea of the notion of opposites between a clash of civilization and a dialogue of civilizations, and in fact, going back to the Middle Ages, are not in fact opposites. Confrontation, if you will, military crusade, conversation, interreligious dialogue, Christian missions, and cooperation have always been a part of both the Middle Ages and the Crusades. But the kind of optic of emphasizing the violence is as much a part of our contemporary culture, the impact of Hollywood on our understanding of the Middle Ages. So part of the purpose for this presentation of Crusades and Clashes of Civilizations Then and Now is to reorient part of this discussion. Second, I think it's mindful that we start thinking of the Middle Ages and the Crusades. That the Crusades, that period of the Middle Ages, perhaps the last time that Western scholars, meaning at that time Christian scholars, took Islam, took Islamic philosophy seriously as part of their beginnings to grapple with understanding the world. And the third element or the third point I think I want to make as an overall point, is this notion of the Mediterranean tradition of civilizations, looking both the Greeks, the Romans, but particularly the Greeks, but the way Greek philosophy impacted Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and a recovery of that tradition and that dialogue between those civilizations, I think, is a very important element for the future. And of course, this has a lot of implications for the EU and EU policy. But to remember that this Greek tradition is the tradition of all three of these religious traditions, I think needs to be stated. And a fourth is the following: the idea of what I'm going to call a radical Abrahamic social ontology. Many of you know, if no, it's not forgotten, that the patriarch Abraham was the father of both Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So from the perspective of a radical Abrahamic social ontology, Jews, Christians, and Muslims are actually siblings. They're brothers and sisters, rather than the other, rather than enemies, rather than mutual barbarians. These other concepts are something else. But of course, it hasn't seemingly worked out that way. Why? Because basically, there's nothing sacred. Things are only sacred in relationship to other things. How that's decided is about politics, power, authority, and legitimacy, and the way they get worked out in relationship to these communities. So if you want to take religion seriously, if you want to take culture seriously, you have to take the politics of the construction of these categories seriously. This is different from a widespread of American agenda of simply trying to say, under what conditions does religion cause war and cause peace? This goes back to a concept of the ambivalence of the sacred that Scott Appleby at Notre Dame developed, which in many ways is a very fine concept when I think used constructively. But that concept goes back to Rudolf Otto's The Idea of the Holy. If you go to the internet, it's the most famous book on religious studies in the 20th century. When was this written? In the context of the First World War, to try to come to grips with German irrationalism, the understanding of that war. What am I saying? I'm saying that events in international relations is actually very important for the study of the construction of the very concepts we talk about in theology and religious studies, of which Jocelyn knows far more about this, I think, than I do. But the way in which her presentation intersects with these issues, I think, is very important. So those actually are the beginnings of my opening comments of why I think we want to go back then to looking at the Crusades. Because indeed, when we think about Huntington's Clash of Civilizations ideas, it's just taken for granted. The Crusades, that's a classic example of the Clash of Civilizations. But what's most been remarkable in the last 10 years is the number of scholars of international relations who've actually gone back to the Crusades literature. This is what got me into this. What if scholars of contemporary international relations going back to the Middle Ages for? Well, I knew that I was a kind of odd person to do this, but that other people might want to do this, I found interesting. Okay. This is because, in fact, when we go back to the Crusades in the Middle Ages, there's forms of encounter. And I want to give these three forms of encounter as an optic of looking at the Middle Ages, of which only some of the elements I'll be engaging with. First, as I've said, confrontation. The Crusades as military confrontation is one form of encounter, or the main form of encounter. Cooperation between the Christian West and the Islamic world. Now, in some of the responses to the Clash of Civilizations, this notion of cooperation has been emphasized, particularly trade relations. The Republic of Venice, we all know about this if we're Italian, right? The Muslims then granting Christian access to the pilgrim sites, and the Franciscan custody of the holy places in Jerusalem. Next year is the 800th anniversary of the meeting between Francis of Assisi and the Sultan of Egypt. I'm arranging a panel to put together scholars on this at the European Academy of Religion next year. So part of the element is the new research talking about these understandings of cooperation and dialogue and interreligious dialogue going back to the very heart of the Middle Ages and Crusades. In other words, crusading and dialogue occurred at the same time. And this is this element of conversation. I mixed what I'm saying. Cooperation is this elements of trade, relations, pilgrimages. But conversation is this third element of encounter. So confrontation, cooperation, and conversation. And this is Christian missions, Muslim-Christian interreligious dialogue. And in fact, it turns out that this dialogue took place at the same time, very often, as the Crusades. And this goes back to the fact that we think about, in the Crusades, they thought the Muslims were the enemies, and they were barbarians, and all of this. Actually, this is not the case. Muhammad was perceived to be, I believe in Dante, as a schismatic rather than a heretic. But even heretics can be converted to the truth. The role of rational argument is also important. In other words, the notion of the other, the enemy, is something else that has to be constructed. So, one of the elements that I want to mention, therefore, is this emphasis on the Crusades in international relations scholarship. It turns out that realists, neo-realists who emphasize power have always tried to explain religion away as simply this element of power relations, territory. And of course, Marxists have always tried to explain away the Crusades in terms of class conflict between serfs and peasants versus the church versus the landed nobility. In other words, for realists and Marxists, and in fact, religion does in that sense get explained away. The relevance of this argument is simply the fact that this is only one variation of the earlier argument with the Crusades. Were they about religion or something else? The so-called wars of religion in early modern France, were they about religion or were they about something else? What about the 30 Years' War? Was that about religion or something else that led to the construction of modern international society? What about September 11? Was that about religion or something else? Is ISIS Islamic or is it something else? What I'm saying is that all of these are variations of this similar kind of question, and what you need to be aware is that this discussion in the humanities and in history, in each one of these areas, has been brought back the discussions of role of religion, the role of doctrine, the role of ideas, and practices, and is no longer dismissed. And so constructivist understanding of the Crusades bring out this dimension of both dialogue, but ideas and doctrine. But there's something else that's a part of this discussion you need to be aware of. Again, and whether this is a kind of underlying Protestant sensibility. I mean, what do Protestants talk about? Protestants say, are you a believer? It's about ideas. What do Jews say? Are you an observant Jew? Are you a practicing Muslim? Are you a practicing Catholic? All these other traditions are far more social than this emphasis on ideas. Some of us who do international relations read books on, like, ideas in foreign policy, and we don't think anything of it. Is there an underlying Protestant understanding, a culturally Protestant understanding of ideas? But of course, ideas, according to Pierre Hadot, French philosopher of the early modern, the Greeks, ideas have never been about ideas. Ideas have always been about what? Ways of living. Now, Fred has talked about this going back to Erasmus. In the discussions of Erasmus, specifically about the ability of living faithfully in the world. Each one of these elements I've mentioned to you, whether it's confrontation, whether it's cooperation, whether it's the discussion or the conversation are all ways of engaging these communities about living faithfully in the world. In each one of these elements, looking at the Crusades, the kinds of ideas that are involved, it involves that kind of understanding. But this also, you see, ideas are not just about verbal propositions. Given the linguistic turn in philosophy, ideas are understood also through the cultural linguistic framing of the way communities see and interpret the world. This is why the relationship between ideas, practices, and institutions, the role of spirituality, the role of interreligious dialogue is central to how each one of these elements that I've mentioned to you, these 3 C's, are worked out in state systems and during the Middle Ages in each one of these areas. And of course, it was Francis of Assisi, who was this light, who began this kind of dialogue in the midst of the Fifth Crusade, to be able to learn more deeply about his own understanding of the Christian faith through his Muslim mother, the Sultan of Egypt. So the transformation, therefore, the role of conversion in dialogue. What I mentioned to you earlier about this social ontology, people learn to become other people. People learn to become people through other people. That dynamic notion of social ontology, how this gets worked out, is exactly what's happening in these 3 elements in the Middle Ages. To simply call that violence, to simply call it the war, is to miss out a whole new history. There's even a journal called Medieval Encounters, to emphasize the varieties of encounters. And so if these encounters were as varied in the Middle Ages as this time which we said that must be a clash of civilizations, well, maybe this might give a different optic of how we understand the relationship between different cultures and allegedly in the clashes of civilizations today, and indeed going back to this earlier period of when people did encounter the other, and what this meant for their own faith traditions and engagements is also a way forward. And so this is why I think amidst 25 years of the clash of civilizations, going back to the Middle Ages and finding out what really happened, or the contested nature of what happened, is actually an important optic for the 21st century. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas. It's very much in my spirit too, and thank you for invoking Erasmus, who is very dear to me. But ultimately, it goes back to Aristotle. Lex's ideas all are embedded in praxis. Everything is way of life. That's what Aristotle means by praxis. It's a way of life. It's not just pushing somebody in the face, but how to live. How to live a faith, how to live your ideas. So it's good old Aristotle. Okay, thank you, all 3 of you now.